Welcome to Intro to Game Development Week 4. I'm Dr. Phelan, and today we're going to be talking about iterative design. The book covers a couple other things, thinking like a designer, iterative design, and we're going to look at both of those concepts together. The concept of iterative design is to repeatedly go through an analysis, design, implementation, and testing cycle with your game, and this is something that a lot of successful game studios do. And we're going to look at a case study for this by PopCap Games for their very successful game that came out in 2009 that I'm sure many of you have seen or played called Plants vs. Zombies. So if you're unfamiliar with the game, it's basically a tower defense game with plants. You position plants in different spots, hordes of zombies come and attempt to march to the opposite side of the screen, and your plants are there to stop them. And there are different phases and different zombies that come up, and different types of plants with different powers. Very similar to most tower defense games, but extremely successful. At the time this presentation was given, so these slides are from a GDC conference in China back in 2010, and at that time, over 1.5 million copies had been sold, 15 million downloads. They had made over a million from the App Store in 1 week, and it was the number one title on the iPhone in China and the top 10 on the iPad. So, pretty impressive stats for a game that had just come out. So, in this presentation, they talk about a bunch of things about the history of the game, and I encourage you to track down the original video if you can, or the full set of original slides. So one of the things they talk about is the importance of prototyping your ideas so that you can playtest them, and to do this early and often. You'll see this process repeated over and over again throughout this design process. It will go through how they iterate, how they playtest, how they get feedback, and then that cycle begins again and again. So you need to make sure you have a playable version of your game as early as possible, even if it's only playable with paper and pencil prototypes. It doesn't have to be completely implemented, but obviously having it in code is going to be a better experience. They also talk about, this is just kind of fun, they talk about iterating over the name. Plants vs. Zombies was actually a working title. They weren't planning to use that. They thought about doing Lawn of the Dead, but then Dawn of the Dead came out, so they went back to their working title for a little bit, came up with a couple of other titles, Zombotany, Bloom and Doom. Both of those titles actually make it into the game in different places, but they have a complete list of all the different names that their team came up with or suggested, or things that they were kind of workshopping as titles for the game. None of those obviously made it, and the final release was named Plants vs. Zombies. So the main idea of their presentation for their iterative design process is to continually remove frustration while adding more fun. One of the things that the designers really liked were collectible trading card games like Magic the Gathering and Pokemon, and so they wanted to incorporate cards, collectible cards in the game. And instead of having cards, you end up with packets of seeds, but they look very similar to Magic the Gathering cards, where you've got that plant artwork on the top and you've got their powers listed below. And then those cards or seed packets kind of scroll across the screen in some of their levels. So this was a concept they wanted to include. They also iterate over the art process. So originally, George Fan came up with kind of the concept art of what he was envisioning the game to look like, and they had different artists come in and provide sketches and their interpretation of that concept. Rich Warner, who became the final artist for the game, was selected based on that, and then he also went through various iterations before they finalized on the art style that they wanted to adopt, which you can see in the lower right. So when you are working on a game design team, you want to make sure that everyone has creative input into that design process throughout, not just the game designer or the product owners. Ted Simple talks about working there, and he was a character animator, and talks about how when they were working on the reanimation system, they were able to add a bunch of different things, and how they get to add their personal touch to the game. Um, and so that was just something that it's important to think about as a designer. Make sure that your design team all have equal voice into that design process. So again, coming back to iterative design, they talk about the importance of testing early and testing often, and making sure your playtesters are providing feedback. They had a comment system where they could track feedback from playtesters, and whether those were bugs or just comments and things that they had finished working on. The exact system they're using isn't so important here, but what is important is how easy it was to submit comments and bug reports and suggestions to the design team. Here's a good example of a piece of feedback by the spouse of one of the people on the PopCaps game team. Just talking about, and again, you can see that the working title at this point was still Lawn of the Dead, but talking about the importance of helping players understand how important sunflowers were in the game because they had no offensive capabilities, and it wasn't obvious in early stages of the game that you needed those in order to survive. Someone else sent in a similar comment about that. Someone else then talks about how they run out of money or sun ability in the beginning, and then somebody else also talks about a similar concept, how it's not obvious that the sunflowers are so critical to the game. So when you do player testing and you get feedback, everyone's going to have a bunch of different ideas. And sometimes, like these one off ideas, as the designer, you have to decide, is this important or not? Is this fit to the vision of the game? But if there's a pattern of a whole bunch of people repeatedly sharing similar comments or frustrations, then that's something that you need to pay attention to. And so one of the things they did, they start out with a smaller lawn. They provide a certain amount of money and they give you two cards and they say, okay, here are the two things you should build right now. They also fade in one of the cards, I think, in later versions of the game. So they made it really obvious what you were supposed to do with the sunflowers. Early on, what was happening is they'd provide you a bunch of different options. You would have a certain amount of money, and you can see here someone's gotten into a situation where they've spent all their money, didn't have any sunflowers, and will not generate any more sun. They also added, in case you get into trouble, sun falling from the sky. This was a later addition to help people who made a mistake and maybe didn't plant a sunflower and got into a situation where they could no longer do that. They also made the sunflower cheaper so that it would be more enticing to plant one of those. So all of this under the umbrella of helping to prevent players from making bad choices. So um, if you present them with too much at once, they're going to make the wrong choice and you get into situations like this where they are going to run into trouble. Now, one of the important things about playtesting is to measure. And so we talked about a qualitative feedback system where people are sending in information and their feedback and their experiences, but it's also important to have a quantitative feedback system where you can actually measure and compare metrics of different things. One of the things that PopCap Games did is they tracked how long it took different players to complete levels so that they could identify levels that were too difficult or too easy. So across the x-axis here, you can see the name of the level, and on the y-axis, the number of seconds it took to win the level, and then the min, max, and average times for each of those. And you can see they've identified a section of levels that were just too easy based on how quickly they were being beat. So they also tracked the number of times people won or lost a level or had to restart it. And you can see that certain levels they've highlighted as being problematic as being outside of the norm, and so they can make adjustments to the difficulty of those levels based on that metric. They also tracked information about which plants were being chosen for levels versus which ones were actually being used, and they could then tweak different plant characteristics and costs accordingly to make sure that things are being used appropriately. The other thing they talk about in their iterative process is the importance of just adding elements of fun. We talked about that earlier, the remove frustration, add fun idea. And so all the snow zombies, they initially had this whole snow level. And in that level, they introduced zombie yetis and zombonis and things like that. And these are things that made it into the final game based on player feedback. And it was just kind of this idea of doing something really fun. So this is their summary. The key thing here, they have all these different things, but the key thing is that iterative design process. Make sure you are prototyping in a way that you can allow playtesting and collect feedback and get that feedback both qualitatively and, if you can, quantitatively as well, because that will help you to make data-driven decisions about the game design. All right, so that is everything we're going to talk about. The book goes into more detail about that iterative process and thinking like a designer. But again, if you can track down this full presentation, I suggest that you look that up. It is quite long, but worth watching if you can find it. And if you have any questions, reach out on Slack or through email.